Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 5 Things Successful Companies Consider When Changing Their HR Software Platform, presented by HR Morning and sponsored by PayPro. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's 60-minute program. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Patrick Sayers, President, Newcastle Research.
All right, thanks, Ty. I have the my video up just for the introduction, so people can put a name and face to the voice. But I'll close it down so you can focus on the slides during the presentation, and then I'll come back so you can see me during the Q&A. All right, thanks again, Ty, and thanks to everyone for attending. I know everyone's busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. And I hope you find today's webinar helpful. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so I want to spend just a minute or two talking about Newcastle Research and our approach for 2 reasons. First, just to provide some background on where these recommendations came from. You know, whenever I'm sitting in an audience, I always like to understand, particularly when somebody is giving recommendations, I like to understand where those recommendations came from. You know, what experiences are they drawing on? Where do they get their information? Essentially, you know, why should I listen to this person? Why should I care what they're talking about? And second, I think providing a bit of color on our approach will give you some insight into how we encourage our customers to think about the selection process. So I promise I'm not going to turn this into an infomercial. I'm going to get to the recommendations and the considerations, but I think some background, some color will help. So Newcastle Research is a research and advisory firm focused on the human capital management market. Simply put, we help our customers choose the best HR solution for them. My personal background is a mix of research, consulting, and competitive intelligence. I worked in IT consulting for a number of years. Then I worked for an HCM vendor for close to a decade, primarily in competitive intelligence. So my job was to know the players in this market, their strengths, their weaknesses, why customers choose them, why customers don't choose them. And now with Newcastle Research, I put that experience and knowledge to work for my customers. We're trying to find the best HR solution for them. So the first half of that, or one half of that coin, you know, in order to help customers find the right solution, we need to have a thorough understanding of the options available to customers, right? So we regularly sit through demos and conduct interviews with leading HCM vendors and their partners to review new products and services. That's one half of the equation. The companies you see here should not be interpreted as a recommendation or endorsement. I have them here simply for illustrative purposes to give you an idea of the companies that we follow. But as I said, that's only one half of the coin, one half of the equation. Knowing the HCM vendors and understanding their offerings. The other half, the second thing we need to understand to be effective for our customers is to understand the customer. And what I mean by the customer, you know, obviously the customer that we're working with to help find the right solution for them. We need to understand them, their needs, their wish list, if you will. But for this slide, what I'm talking about, the other side of the equation is the customer in general, right? We need to understand the customers who are happy with their HR software platform, and we need to understand the customers who are unhappy, right? Because we want to learn from their mistakes. But the most important thing are those happy customers. We need to understand, how did those happy customers get there, right? How did that organization find the right HR software platform for them? That's the key. That's understanding the how. So one approach rather than the who. And what I mean by that is, you know, one approach is to find a company with a successful HR technology strategy and simply use the same HR software vendor that they use, right? But it doesn't always work because every company is different. Hospital is a very different entity than, you know, a fast food restaurant is very different than a trucking company, right? And so simply, to some extent, you can ask for references that look like you and mimic what they're doing. But even there, you're going to find differences, you know, all the way down to culture from one company to another. So the better strategy, you know, to really get to the bottom of why some HR technology approaches succeed and others fail, a better approach, in my experience, is to find a company with a successful HR technology strategy and work backwards to understand the process that that company used to achieve that success. What questions did they ask during the vendor search? What did they understand about the implementation before project kickoff? What did they consider at each stage of the process, from selection to go live? And that's the focus of the talk today. Because what we found is if you find enough companies with successful HR technology strategies and work backwards to understand how each of those companies achieved that success, you start to notice that the things they considered along the path to that success are often the same. And what I'm covering today, these are 5 of those things. Just to be clear, these are not the only 5 things that you should consider, but they're important, and together they're going to help. They're going to help you significantly increase your chance of finding an HCM vendor that you're happy with. So let's get right to it. So consideration number 5, what's the right HR vehicle for your company? So before I get too far into the slide, let me define what I mean by vehicle. I'm not talking about a particular vendor or brand. I'm talking about the model. So PEO versus a complete HR outsourcing versus a cloud-based HCM software platform that your employees use. And let me preface this discussion with an acknowledgement that this isn't going to apply to many of you, probably most of you. I'm guessing 90% of you on the call today are going to end up going with a cloud-based HCM solution. So you've already settled on a vehicle, and the rest of the presentation is squarely focused on that vehicle. So you might ask yourself, well, if you know it doesn't apply to 90% of us, why are you bringing it up? The reason is because I see this situation often enough that it's worth covering, because I think companies really do themselves a disservice if they don't end up comparing similar vehicles. So although it might not apply to a lot of you, it's pretty devastating when it happens, and I've seen it twice in the past, say 3 to 6 months. So I use a car analogy here because shopping for a vehicle is something that most people can relate to. The bottom line is this: if your final decision is between 3 different types of vehicles, the search didn't appropriately reflect your needs. And what I'm talking about that is, what I referenced, twice in the past, 1 quarter or 2, I ran into a couple of companies and they were feeling pretty good about their search, and they had narrowed it down to 3 very different vehicles, right? So they had a PEO, they had, the SaaS, cloud-based HCM provider that we're going to spend most of the conversation talking about. And all three of the vehicles are great, right? The vehicles that we have up here on the slide, they're all great. One's a Tesla, I think that's a Ducati, a Land Rover. So all very expensive vehicles. But the thing to keep in mind is that they were designed to do very different things, right? And similarly, a PEO, HRO, and a cloud-based HCM software platform used by your own employees are 3 very different paths for your company. So you might be asking, well, what's wrong with considering the different vehicles? And I want to be clear, nothing at all. By all means, consider them. Do your homework. I'm not suggesting any of those vehicles are not worthy of consideration, but ultimately what I recommend is picking a vehicle and then comparing different offerings within that category vehicle. Because if you don't, and you get to the end of your process and you're comparing different types of vehicles, your process wasn't designed to find the best option within that category. So if you have a PEO versus an HRO versus any of the vendors that we saw on that intro slide, the chances you might get the best one in that category, but you'd be pretty lucky if you did. You're better off narrowing it down and then comparing like entities. Okay, so that's all I'm going to spend on that. So consideration number 4, single HCM versus integrated HCM. This is a topic that comes up a lot. HCM vendors will use terms like single, unified, integrated, best of breed, and seamless to describe their solutions. And it's important to understand that those terms will mean different things at different vendors. So the way I have it outlined on this slide is how most vendors define it, but it's still important to dig a little deeper when a vendor says that their system is a quote unquote single system or integrated. And to be clear, for this discussion for this slide, I'm talking about the architecture, not whether the solution is purchased from a single vendor, because there are a lot of solutions out there that aren't really truly single HCM solutions, even though they're sold by one vendor. And I'll be discussing reseller scenarios in a couple of minutes on a different slide. So again, for now, I'm talking about the architecture. What's the difference and why does it matter? So a single HCM, as you can see on the slide, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you, but a single HCM is essentially a solution, HR, payroll, time and attendance, often a lot of talent management modules in there as well, that is built from the ground up on a single code base. So single database, there's one employee record. An integrated HCM is the opposite. You'll hear terms like Frankenstein or cobbled together, but it's basically those different modules might be HR, payroll, and then time and attendance or workforce management, and then talent management. They might be three completely different systems that have been kind of glued together. So, and there's a bunch of different flavors of that. Could be, as I said, glued together by one vendor, right? So there's a lot of examples that we could point to of companies, that have been through a merger, or an acquisition, or even a long-term partnership where there might be some white labeling of software involved, and they're piecing those together. And at first glance, it might seem like one system. They might skin it, with the same logo, or it could be, glued together by the customer, right? So they have a one-to-one relationship with an HR payroll provider, for example, and they have a different relationship on different paper, signed a different contract with a time and attendance provider. And then their own team does a lot of work to kind of make that work. And again, just to be clear, just because a solution is sold under one brand doesn't mean the solution is a single HCM. So why does it matter? Generally speaking, a single HCM is going to be easier and less costly to maintain. It's going to have a consistent user interface and experience across the modules, which isn't always the case with an integrated solution. From a reporting perspective, for example, it's simpler and quicker to create custom reports because the modules are all drawing from the same database. Human error is reduced when you don't have to manually enter data into different systems. You have a single security management view with a single HCM. So there are a lot of benefits. So here's the problem. So every vendor who has a single problem for the customer in order to kind of navigate these waters, every single vendor who has a single HCM is going to tell you that it's a must-have, right? And every vendor who doesn't have a single HCM is going to downplay the importance, and it's going to tell you that it's not a big deal. And just as an aside, this is kind of the public service announcement portion of this slide. Not all vendors are completely forthcoming when prospects start asking about their architecture. I've seen this more times than I can count. A customer will ask, well, is this a single HCM? And the vendor knows what they're asking. They're asking if it's on a single database, single code base, and the vendor says, oh, it's seamless. It's completely integrated, right? So they're not actually answering the question. And that's sometimes my role, on the customer side, to be their advocate. And well, most of the offerings out in the market, I know what the architecture is anyway. But anyway, that's, as I said, public service announcement. Just because someone says that it's seamless or this or that, ask some very specific questions about architecture if you care about that. And I'm suggesting that you should care about that. So the real question is a single HCM a must-have? And so for me, there are very few must-haves. And that might sound odd, but it's, looking for the best solution for you is all about, it's a balancing act, right? So you want your wish list, you want the best technology, you want the best architecture driving that, you want the best customer service experience, you want the best user interface, you want the best, workflows, you want the best of everything, including price. But guess what? If you have, and there is no vendor out there that has the best of everything, but if they did, it would be the most expensive product out there. So it's all about understanding what the options are, what the different variables at play are, and just weighting them appropriately to figure out what's best for you. So, but I will say, although I have very few must-haves other than kind of meeting your budget and your feature functionality requirements, the single HCM is about as close to a must-have as I can get. to continue with the car analogy, for example, I live in New England. Is all-wheel drive and heated seats a must-have? No, there's a lot of cars, but I don't think I'd ever buy a car without those two things. So for me, if you're not going to go with a single HCM solution, there better be a really good reason. In other words, you better be getting something in one of those other categories that is really just tough to say no to, for example. Okay, consideration number 3. Understand the implementation before signing. Understand the implementation plan. So I wanted to put this one in here because it's an oft underweighted consideration, and it can be the cause of big problems down the road. So customers engage with Newcastle Research to help them pick a new HCM vendor. So that means they're not happy with their current one. And part of my job is to understand where their pain points are so that I can help them avoid that with their next vendor. As a result, I hear a lot of accounts of where things went wrong. And often that customer-vendor relationship began to fail during the implementation, before they were even up and running on the solution. I can't tell you how often I hear some version of the following, right? So we were really excited, and then we did our homework and we picked the features and functionality, and we went through the whole process, and it was a long, arduous process, and we were really excited to be finally at the finish line. And then the implementation was a disaster, right? And the customer-vendor relationship never recovered. And again, I'm gonna have some public service announcements along the way. So just to be aware, this is more prevalent with some companies than others. I'm not going to mention any companies by name on a public call like this. If you want to engage with Newcastle, I can give you some behind the scenes information on that. But there are some companies out there with very aggressive sales cultures. They're all about growing the top line, and will say just about anything to get the deal signed. And then it gets thrown to the implementation team, and hopefully, I guess their strategy is hopefully the customer doesn't get mad enough to leave. But it's, I don't want to pin it all on the vendors. Sometimes it is the customer's fault, is partly to blame. Some company or some customers go into that implementation process with an unrealistic view of how much is going to be done for them, right? So it takes heavy lifting on both sides to change, to kind of change the course of that aircraft carrier. You're going to have to do some heavy lifting. It's going to take, meaning the customer, you're going to have some bodies on that. It's going to take a lot of time. So the signing the document, signing on the dotted line and going with that's not really the end. That's not the finish line. That's really kind of just the beginning. But so here's some things to look for, right? So really good companies, the ones that I would say kind of get it, are interested in building long-term relationships. And they demonstrate that during the sales process, during the implementation process, and after the customer is up and running. If you get a sense during any of those phases of the relationship that the vendor doesn't have your best interest in mind, that's a red flag. There's a convenient avoidance of the subject among companies that aren't as strong in implementation because it's beneficial for the sale. So if you get any sense of, oh yeah, just let's get going, we'll sign, and then don't worry, we'll figure it out. So you want to partner with somebody who, because they're the experts in this area, right? So if you're with a company for 10, 20 years, hopefully you pick the right one the first time, and you never have to change. But these, so this is something in your HR or finance or IT career, you might only go through 2-3 of these in your entire career, maybe less. Where the vendors, they do it all day, every day, right? So they should have a plan, right? So they should be able to give you a pretty good estimate of not just the timeline, but what kind of time the process is going to demand of certain employees. What are you responsible for? What are we responsible for? So if they don't have that plan, if they can't give you details, or if they're nervous about talking about it, that's definitely a red flag, because I've seen a lot of excited customers, or once excited customers, tell me stories about how things went so wrong during the implementation. Okay, consideration number 2. I'm just taking an eye on the time. I think we're doing okay. Reselling situations. So I get asked about this a lot. There are a number of reselling scenarios out there, and some I have no problem with. In fact, and this may surprise some people on the phone, but there are actually situations where I would recommend a reseller over the actual software vendor who developed the product. So I'm going to cover the different scenarios, my relative comfort level with them, and some questions to ask. So there are situations where a vendor is selling part of another. Actually, I'm just going to build out the whole slide. So there are situations when a vendor is selling part of another vendor's solution, and there are situations where a vendor is selling the entire solution. The reason one of those is a red flag and warrants some further investigation for me comes down to architecture and the business relationship, and I'll cover those in a moment. But first, I want to address a concern that gets raised a lot around product knowledge. Specifically, the question I get asked is, as a customer, are you somehow sacrificing quality of service by buying through a reseller? And the short answer is no. I think this is a common misconception. The idea that just because a company built the software, that they're the best ones to service it, it doesn't hold a lot of water in my experience. And I want to be clear that that's not a knock on the folks who build the software. They have just as much of a chance of giving the best quality service around that as anyone else. But my point is that there's nothing inherently wrong with the structure of a reselling situation that would prevent folks from being just as knowledgeable as the folks at the software provider. The software companies that have chosen to use a partner distribution channel, those software companies, the executives there, they want those partners to succeed, right? They have access, meaning the partners, they have access to the same information, the same knowledge. Right, there's often a co-opetition aspect, but the executive team wants that to work. And there are whole teams of people whose job and compensation is tied to the success of those partners. So, for example, let's say, I'm not gonna use any names, but because this is actually not common, but there are a number of examples of this in the industry. So big software developer XYZ, they have a partner distribution network. So there's a VP at big software developer XYZ, and they're quota carrying just like someone, a sales VP who's responsible for a team that's selling direct. And believe me, the executives are paying attention to that quota and they want it to succeed. So this notion, it's also worth noting that some of these larger companies who use a partner distribution network, in some cases, those partners are used for implementation as well, right? So this notion that buying through a partner is somehow inferior is simply not true, in my experience. Is it possible that your overall experience could be better by purchasing directly through the software developer? Yes, absolutely. But in some cases, it can actually be better for the customer to go with a reseller. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. My point here is that, in my experience, who is doing the selling isn't what determines the quality of the experience, and shouldn't be what drives that decision. So consideration number 1, just taking a quick look at time. Hint, it's probably why you left your last vendor. So customer service, and I don't think, and you see the footnote at the bottom, as I said, Newcastle Research, because we talk to so many customers, and because we talk to vendors as well, the folks that we have a good line of communication with, they're pretty candid about these types of things. But even if we're not being paid to help a customer, we're talking to customers all the time, just because that's the knowledge base that drives Newcastle Research's business. But in our experience, 2 out of 3 customers cite poor customer service as the primary reason for switching HCM vendors, and that's not that shouldn't be a surprise, right? I mean, you can type some rudimentary search in Google, and you can find probably 100 different studies that cite how important customer service is and why it's the number 1 reason people leave. And my point here is that if it's the number 1 reason why companies leave their HCM vendor, shouldn't it be the number 1 consideration when selecting a new vendor, right? I can't tell you how often I'll sit down with a customer and they have their list, their wish list, and their must-haves, their nice-to-haves, And a lot of times it's all about features, it's all about functionality, it's all about price, and all those things are important. I don't want to diminish any of that. But sometimes in this conversation, so many times I say, all right, well, time out. Why are you leaving who you're leaving? They say, oh, customer service. We hate customer service. I was like, well, okay, so where is that on your must-have? And they're like, well, yeah, no, it's really important, but how do we determine that, right? How do we, until we're actually in there, that's not, we can read reviews and stuff, but so just because it's tougher to diagnose, sometimes it's not included in their metric, right? And so my advice to customers that I'm working with and to you on the phone is, just because something is more difficult because it's very easy to look at a list and say, okay, we need this, we need succession planning, we need performance management, we need HR, all these things to say, okay, yeah, they have that, check. Customer service it's tougher. It's more of a gray area. And to make matters worse, the next bullet here, how do you evaluate it? Because every HCM vendor that comes in to talk to you will tell you that customer service is their top priority. So how do you cut through that? How do you determine that? So you can look at reviews, and there's a lot. You can look at G2 Crowd and Trust Radius, and you can look at feedback on Glassdoor and CSAT metrics and Net Promoter Scores, and so there's and I'm not diminishing any of those. That's all valid, but there are flaws inherent with all of them, right? So I just saw this the other day. A customer put some, because we talked to not a customer, a vendor put some material in front of me the other day because they want me to be up to speed on their product, and they want me to think that they're great. And so they put these metrics in front of me, and they're like, oh, 99% customer sat, and that's great, yes. But my question to them was, okay, well, what was your response rate? They're like, oh, 20%. And I'm like, okay, so that's great. But what you're telling me is that 99% of 20% of your customers really like you. But I just read a study the other day. I forget if it was Bain or Accenture, but something like 1 out of every 26 customers will complain. The other 25 are just going to leave, right? So yes, all things being equal, a customer sat score of 99% is better than a customer sat score of 95%. Is better than a customer sat score of 90%. So all things being equal, yeah, take that into consideration. I'm not suggesting you can't or you shouldn't, but this is the number one thing that I suggest people look at, because really it's the one metric that takes into consideration the entire customer base, and that's customer retention, right? Because ultimately, customers vote with their dollars, right? So the goal of all these companies is to keep, meaning the vendors, the goal of all these vendors is to keep their customers, right? They're in business to make money, and they want their customers to keep paying them. So this, in my experience, and I've been in this industry for 15, 20 years, this is the best metric, the best barometer for customer service. Typically, the customers are the vendors that have the highest customer retention. And sometimes they'll point to revenue retention, sometimes they'll point to customer retention. And those two things are not synonymous, but most of the companies point to revenue retention. There's a real high correlation, in my experience, between customer retention and quality of customer service. So before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to answer a question that always comes up when I talk about customer retention. What's the right number, right? So there are two ways to answer that question. One is a relative number, right? So if you have narrowed your mix because of all the factors in play, if you narrowed down your possible candidates to, say, 3 vendors, it's a relative comparison, right? One has 90, one has 93, one has 96. Well, 96, best one, right? But for me, in my experience, there's also an absolute way to look at it, and that number for me is right around 95%. So typically what I like to see is 95% or higher for customer retention or revenue retention. And here's why. Part of that is just experience. I know these companies very well. As I said, I worked in competitive intelligence for one of the major players for nearly 10 years, and my job day in, day out was to understand every single thing about these competitors. So I understand that there's a real high correlation between that customer retention and quality of service. But also, if you take a step back, it kind of makes sense, right? So there's a certain percentage of churn, if you will, that really a vendor can't do much about, right? So, vendor A or customer A is going with vendor A, and customer B is going with vendor B, and they're both really happy. Well, customer A and customer B merge, or one acquires the other. Well, guess what? Even though they were very happy with their respective vendors, someone's going to lose that business, right? So, because they're going to consolidate, right? And so there's a certain amount, and mergers happen with the vendors as well, as we've seen in the past year. So there's a certain percent, and you have people who come in, you're right, there's a new chief human resources officer, there's a new chief finance officer, and they really had a good experience with this vendor in the past, and so they just have a bias toward them. So there's a certain percentage of customers that are just going to leave, and there's nothing you can really do about it. For me, in my experience, my observations, that 95% line, so I can kind of wave that away, or kind of, give that permission, if you will, look the other way for the 95% above is kind of natural churn. Once you get down below that, there's something else going on, right? And that's not a knock on them. Actually, most companies are not above, are not at 95 and above. But as I said, it all goes back to that balance, right? You have a matrix of things that are important to you. And so this is one of those things. So if you're not getting, a company with 95, 96, 97% customer retention, well, there better be a reason for that, right? So you better be getting something else. You better be getting, whatever, a great price, functionality that you couldn't get elsewhere, and that type of thing. Down below 95%, there's some other reason that it's down that way. And it might seem, and this is also what I encourage my clients to take a look, because a comment that I hear a lot is, well, they're at 92%, they're at 93%, they're at 90%, that's an A minus. I said, yeah, but look at it this way. Let's say you have someone at 92%, because there's a lot of companies right around there, and then you're comparing that to somebody at 96%, right? So that means for every 100 customers that they have on day one, the company with 96%, 4 of those companies have left. 92% sounds like a good number, but but exactly twice as many customers have chosen to leave. That's a 100% increase, right? So yeah, 92% sounds great. But that's the number one consideration that when I talk to customers, is because that, as I said, that you can't hide from that, right? You can in some cases not massage, but your G2 scores or Glassdoor, that's heavily influenced by marketing. Customer retention, that's not something you can massage in any way, shape, or form. Okay, I think we're good on time. Ty, why don't we take some questions? I'll put myself back over to video so you can see me now, since you don't have to pay attention.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrick. And as Patrick mentioned, I would now like to take your questions. So if you have questions, please submit them into the chat box now. And we did get a handful while you were presenting. So our first question reads, is there a particular customer support model that's better than the rest?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, my hesitation is not because I don't have an answer. It's there are multiple factors in play. So it all has to be, so for example, if I'm going to tell you my preference for a customer service model, because typically when I see a model like this, it translates to higher customer service. That said, if somebody has a customer service model and they have 99% customer retention, right, don't dismiss them just because you don't like the model. So that was the reason for my pause there. But yeah, so if we think about, and that's a great question, by the way. So if we think about customer service models, we have, the way I view the world is kind of two ends of the spectrum for customer service models. So we have the traditional call center, right, in which we've all experienced, and I won't use any names from the HCM world, but my cable company, or credit card company, whatever. You call in with an issue and you have no idea who you're going to get. You're never going to get the same person twice. If they can't answer your question, they transfer you to somebody else, and you have to repeat your entire story again. you get disconnected, or if you have to leave, or on hold for too long, you call back the next day, and you got to start from square one. So we all have those stories of pain from a traditional call center model. And on the other end of the spectrum is a dedicated rep model, right? A dedicated customer service rep model. And that sounds great, particularly to those customers who might be coming off of a call center model experience that they're not really enamored with. The problem with the dedicated rep model, what can be a problem with the dedicated rep model, is it's a single point of failure, right? So if they don't know the answer to your question, what happens, right? And so some companies, you're stuck with that one person, and if they're great, awesome, there's no problem. But I've seen this a lot throughout my career, where you talk to customers and they say, oh, that's the model that we have. And when we had Sue, it was awesome. Sue was amazing, and then Sue got promoted, and then we didn't have Sue anymore, and then we got Bob, right? And Bob was terrible, and so it's heavily dependent on the person, because it's a single point of failure. The other reservation I have about the single dedicated rep model is, can you talk to somebody else at that company if that person doesn't have the answer? So some of these companies that have a dedicated rep model, and they promise, and it's going to be amazing, and you're going to have, and it's comforting, as I said, particularly for customers who are coming off a call center model, to know that when they pick up the phone, they're going to call and they're going to talk to Sue, like Sue is there. If Sue doesn't know the answer, though, sometimes she has to go back, or Bob, or whoever it is, they have to go back and talk to somebody else behind the scenes at their company. Often the customer is not allowed to talk to that expert, so that dedicated rep is always the point of contact. And so then you get into a situation where it's kind of like that game you played in kindergarten, where you say something, and then by the time it revolves around all the kids in the circle. I think it was called operator, or telephone. The message, the final message that you get is, it doesn't even resemble what was originally transmitted. So that's one of the problems. So what I like to see, to get back to the original question, is a hybrid, right? So I'd like to see a team-based approach, where you are not going to get lost in call center hell, right? So you're going to be able to talk to certain people. So you have a dedicated team of people. And they are the experts. So they're not, for lack of a better term, they're not just the operator, they're not just the triage person fielding the questions. So you might have somebody, you might have your payroll expert, and you have your tax expert, and you have your benefits expert, and you have your time and attendance or workforce management expert, and they get to know you and your business. So when you're calling them, and you know who to call, right? So you're not just calling in to a random number and then you get transferred to the right person. Like, I know as a customer, if I have a tax question, I call Sally, right? If I have a workforce management question, I'm calling Fred, right? So they get to know you over time. So that's the best model. In my experience, that's the model that I've seen have the lead to the highest customer satisfaction ratings, if you will. Great question.
Thanks, Patrick. Our next question: are there any criteria that customers tend to overweight or overemphasize when selecting a vendor?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I could probably talk for the next 20 minutes just on that. So I'll limit it to a couple, but yeah, no. So I mentioned during the presentation, the implementation, for example, is an underweighted one. So yeah, it's a logical question. What do people tend to overweight? So I'll give you a product related one, and I'll give you kind of a company related one. So the product related one, and I want to preface this by saying aesthetics are important. How it looks, how the solution, how the platform looks. But if I had to pick something, I think that sometimes gets a little overweighted, right? So I've seen customers get to the end of the selection process, and typically, it's after selection process, because if I'm involved, I tend to try to steer them to a more holistic view. But I've seen customers, when I'm talking about, oh, well, what went wrong? Why did you pick your last vendor? Trying to get to the heart of what's important to them. They say, well, they sometimes sheepishly admit, we didn't really know. It was all pretty close at the end, so we picked the pretty one. We picked the one that looked the coolest, the most modern. And there is, I don't want to dismiss that, entirely, right? That is important, because user adoption is important, and it needs to, software needs to be used. And I have my iPhone here. I mean, that's a lot nicer than a BlackBerry used to look. So I get it. It's important, but sometimes I think that carries too much weight toward the end of the process. So for me, it's a tool, right? And so, for example, if I have somebody at 95, 96, 97% customer retention, and there's a company at 92%, customer retention that has an interface that looks a bit more modern, that's probably not going to override the customer retention, for example. Workflows are more important. So yeah, it might look really nice, but if it takes you 4 clicks to, and 4 screens to get what you want done, and the other one that doesn't maybe looks a little more dated gets that job done in 2 clicks, it's more efficient, then that's better. So that's one on the product side. On the company side, sometimes I think customers or prospects tend to overweight the brand name, right? So there's a lot of players in the market. And by the way, which we covered in the reseller section of the presentation, some of the smaller players are selling the same exact solution, right? And sometimes companies dismiss them just because they're not a name brand. So I would people tend to overweight that, and that's not a knock on those big names, those big market leaders, because it's all about getting the best. It's about getting the best technology and pairing that with the best service, right? So some of the smaller names, if it's a really small company that is developing their own software and their entire R&D budget is $2 million, yeah, they might have an amazing commitment to customer service, but I'm a little wary of that. On the flip side, if you have a big, huge name brand and they have great technology, great products, but their customer service is horrible, that's no good either. So it could be that the best solution for you is someone selling that, that technology, but adding a layer of amazing customer service to that. So just to dismiss some of the smaller names out of hand just because you haven't heard of them, take a deeper look. Oh, good question.
Thanks, Patrick. And our next question, are there any additional tangible markers to look for differentiating good customer service?
Yeah, good question. I think this question might have come in, before I talked about the customer retention, but I'll try to add some more color. So yeah, and I mentioned some of them on that slide. So you have, you have reviews out there. So a whole bunch. My hesitation is I'm trying to aggregate all the stuff going on in my head. So references are important. Reviews online. I mentioned G2 and Trust Radius and Glassdoor. Things like that. There's a bunch of other sites that you can look at. Customer satisfaction scores are important. But I'm trying to come up with something I haven't mentioned already. So here's one actually. Tenure of the customer service team. That's a pretty good indication of pretty highly correlated in my experience with the quality of service that you're going to get, right? So if you ask your potential vendor, what's the average turnover? How long do your customer service executives, customer service representatives typically stay at your company? If that's 6 months, if that's a year, that's a concern, right? If it's 5 years, 6 years, then you're feeling a lot better. So that, other than the websites that I mentioned, and other than that overall customer retention, your revenue retention number. That would be another one to add. Is that the tenure of the customer service folks? Good question.
Thanks, Patrick. We do have a few more. Do you have any recommendations regarding who/what departments should be involved internally when evaluating a new HCM platform?
Yeah, everyone. No, I say that in a joking way, but it's not far from the truth. So yeah, you need to get buy-in. My recommendation, I feel like I'm having this looking up at me. My recommendation is to get all the stakeholders involved as early as possible in the process. Get everyone together and go through your wish list, right? Your must-haves, your nice-to-haves, and talk about the plan for your selection process. So a committee-based approach. So just to specifically answer the question, so yeah, HR and IT and finance, get everyone, all the interested parties involved that are going to need to sign off on it. Because what happens, and I get that you can't have half a dozen or a dozen people from different parts of the organization in every meeting. So have some leaders of that selection team, but have regular meetings with all the stakeholders in the process throughout the process. So where I see things go wrong, and where actually Newcastle Research is sometimes invited in to try to rescue the process, is if it's just handed, if one person is handed the project or two people are handed the project and they do everything by themselves, sometimes that's HR. And then they get to the end of the process, and they've spent months on it, and they bring it to their CFO, for example, or they bring in IT, and IT says, well, we can't do that, right? We need this, whatever, behind our own firewall. There's some reason that we can't do that, or the CFO says, no, we're not going to do that. That's beyond the budget. Like, how about this company? And then in 10 minutes, I actually saw an example just like this. They're like, well, in 10 minutes, they just pick somebody else. So that's horrible for a number of reasons. You might not get the best solution, but it's also crippling for morale, right? If you have a couple people kind of get their legs chopped out from under them at the last minute, that's not going to go well. And on the flip side, even if they're able to push through that solution, if anything goes wrong, the CFO or the IT person, so everyone needs to be on board throughout. So the short answer is, get all the stakeholders involved early and often, and have touch bases throughout the process just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Good question.
Thanks, Patrick. And I apologize to the audience member out there. I'm trying to read these in order, and I skipped someone. So again, my sincere apologies. Let's get back to that question. What are the pros and cons of going with a smaller HCM vendor versus one of the larger market share leaders?
Yeah, so some of this might be another situation where somebody submitted, because we touched on this a little bit, but again, I'll try to add some different color. So with the smaller ones, I'm hesitating because I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but in general, the benefit to going with a smaller vendor is you might get better customer service. They might be more familiar if they're geographically, focused. They might be more familiar with the compliance rules and regulations around your particular industry or your particular area. So there's a benefit to that. The benefit to going with a bigger vendor is typically the technology, right? So you have, a huge behemoth, and they're spending $100 million a year in R&D. That's very different than, a really small vendor developing their own software, and they're spending $2 million a year, right? So $2 million is a lot of money, but not when it comes to R&D for software, right? So but you can have both, right? So you can have, and again, it's not a knock on the service with some of the larger players. Some of them have very good service, but some of the big folks use a distribution channel, and for some of those products for which they use that distribution channel, and actually I should have mentioned this in that slide, for some of these vendors, that have chosen, typically it's they sell a product in SMB and mid-market, and just to widen, because it's a pyramid, right? There's only so many 100,000 person companies, and there's a lot more 100 person companies or 1,000 person companies, and so sometimes to increase bandwidth, these big software vendors will use a distribution network. For some of these companies, it's worth mentioning that the distribution network, one in particular that I'm thinking of, the distribution network, the partner network, actually accounts for 90% of the customers, right? So the idea that that it's always better to go with the vendor isn't necessarily the case. So anyway, back to the original thought. That you can get both, right? So you can get a smaller player that's reselling a larger player's technology, and you get the exact same technology with a focus on or more industry knowledge, for example, or more geographic knowledge for the rules and regulations in the state or states in which you play. Good question.
Thank you, Patrick. And our next question, how can I tell if a solution is a truly single unified HCM?
That's a good question. That might have been asked because I mentioned that not all vendors are entirely forthcoming. So yeah, one is just to, well, you can ask me. That would be the surefire way. But there are ways, and just the fact that someone was asking that question is music to my ears, because it means that they're thinking about it critically. But yeah, certainly there are ways to do that. During the demo, for example, some surefire ways to tell if you're going through the demo and you have the dashboard and you click on time and attendance, for example. If that opens up a new window outside of that home dashboard, that's a red flag. If you're looking for a truly unified system, truly single database, because when it opens up a new window, that is often an indication that, okay, that's a separate database. Another way is reporting, actually. So reporting is a good test, because for example, if you create a custom report and you need to draw from time and attendance, and you need to draw from HR, and you need to draw from payroll, so you have different pockets. If it's a truly single database, if it's a unified, single system, that's often as easy as just a drag and drop. You're right, because they're all pulling from the same space. If that's going to take hours to do, that's usually an indication that, okay, there's some mechanic behind the scenes, meaning a functional widget, not an actual person mechanic, that needs to do something to aggregate that, to pull from different databases and then consolidate it. And it's actually, we got a few minutes. Let me tell you a story. While we're talking about reporting, reporting is something I encourage customers to always kick the tires on, because it's something that is not often, but sometimes glossed over by vendors. There's a couple of vendors in particular that I'm thinking of where they don't like to show you how to create a report, because it's not fun. So I remember a story of a customer asking a vendor, well, to show me how to create a report, and they're like, oh, and they handed them a report that had been created, and the customer was like, no, show me how to do it. I don't want you to tell me that you can produce this report. I don't want you to show me a report. Show me how to do it. Walk me through live. And they didn't do it because I don't know if the rep just didn't know how, or they just didn't want to show them the nightmare. And so the customer was like, all right, forget this. But anyway, so look at reporting. But those are some telltale signs of that a system is not truly unified. Good question.
Thanks, Patrick. And our next question reads, why does company culture matter when considering an HCM vendor?
That's an interesting one, because culture is a hot topic right now. We could probably spend an hour just on that. So culture can mean so many different things, right? So I mentioned, so I'll throw a couple of quick, because I'm not sure what they were referring to by culture, so I'll throw a couple different thoughts at you. So I mentioned earlier, one of the vendors that I'm very familiar with has a very aggressive sales culture. And so that company is all about sales. Companies will advertise that they are entirely customer focused, and that's their culture. So culture can mean different things, but to the extent that you want a cultural fit, it's very important because it gets to the heart of, because you're building you want to build a long-term relationship, because folks on selection committees, HR, finance, all these things, they want to get back to doing their jobs, right? They don't want to have to redo this a year from now. So yeah, culture is very important. There are a lot of companies out there that talk about, how good they are to their employees, and that means that their employees are going to be good to you. If that's important to you, then, and I would argue that it should be. Yeah, there are companies out there that have messaging around that. The one word of caution around that is do a little digging to make sure that it's real, because there's a lot of companies jumping on that, we love our employees, they're going to love you bandwagon in terms of messaging. And so it's kind of like, the customer service bullet that I had on that second to last slide there, that every vendor is going to come in and tell you how important customer service is. It's getting to the point where every company is going to be is coming in and talking about how important culture is to them. So I would say just cross-reference that. Do the same homework that you do on for customer service, and actually probably going to be the same vehicles, right? Look out on Glassdoor and G2 and Trust Radius and all of those entities, and also the customer retention, right? If to the extent that culture is a barometer, is some kind of bellwether for culture, then they should be keeping customers at a higher percentage. So, good question.
Thank you much, Patrick. And in order to remain on schedule, we're going to respond to the rest of the questions that came in via email in a timely manner. So with that, I'll turn it back to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah, no, thanks. As I said, thanks for spending an hour with us today. I know everyone's busy, so hopefully this was helpful. My last, as I said, I promise not to turn it into an infomercial, but some feedback I get after customers start working with us is, we were always hesitant to work with an advisory firm or consultant because we were intimidated. If anyone has any questions or wants to explore working with Newcastle Research, definitely set up a call, an introductory call, just to figure out if we can work together. That's always free, so there's no risk there. But and I'm always happy to chat with customers. So thanks for the time, and as I said, I hope you got something from it.
Thanks again, Patrick. On behalf of HR Morning, I would also like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. This concludes our program.